StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।
Namaskar, welcome to this session on philosophers. During the past few sessions, I had spoken about the Western philosophers, the Greek philosophers, and the modern day philosophers like Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill. Today, we are switching over to the Indian philosophers. Like the Western philosophers, in order to understand their philosophy, their understanding of ethics, we have to understand the context in which they wrote, the context in which they thought. If you recall in the previous sessions, I had mentioned that these philosophers were focusing on three aspects. One was the spiritual aspect, the other was the intellectual aspect, and the third was the physical aspect, where the focus was on senses. All the philosophers talked about all three levels. But as you saw in case of Plato, Aristotle and Socrates, the focus was on the spiritual part. Meaning thereby, they're looking at an ideal, a different world, the spiritual world, the ethereal world. And then we came to the intellectual levels where we spoke of Immanuel Kant, the ontology we discussed, that's at the intellectual level. And the third was the physical level where we spoke about the utilitarians who believed in the material part of it. When we talk in terms of Chanakya, he belongs to this category of philosophers, the physical senses part, the material part. The reason was very simple. Unlike the Greek philosophers who existed almost at the same time as Chanakya did, Chanakya was born, as we know, in 350 BC. It was around that time that Western Greek philosophers were talking about their philosophies, their understanding of life. Chanakya was around that time only, but he was looking at more of the material part. Why? The reason is very simple. Whereas Plato, Aristotle and Socrates could think in terms of an ideal situation, of an ideal world, Chanakya was grappling with ground reality. That was a time when we had small kingdoms in the country. Chanakya had a personal experience in this regard when he was virtually thrown out of the Nanda kingdom. As he was trying to unify the country into one, there was a number of them who didn't agree with Chanakya. So Chanakya was worked in a different context. So despite being a contemporary of the Western Greek philosophers, Chanakya had a different approach to understanding of ethics, to understanding of philosophy. Usually, Chanakya is understood to be a person who was trying to espouse cunningness. I think Chanakya is grossly misunderstood in that context. What Chanakya said was that you should be street smart, not unethical, not immoral. Chanakya never promoted immorality or unethical behavior. For him, what was right was right. To achieve that right, like all the philosophers before him or during his time or thereafter, all the philosophers were looking at the good of the people. And when they were looking at good of people, they had their own understanding on how to make people good, how to make people enjoy their lives. Like Epicureans had their own way of people enjoying life. But Chanakya was facing different sets of problems. To him, people were very, very important. You know, usually Chanakya is compared with Machiavelli, who came much later. And Machiavelli wrote in his Prince about the prince, about how to sustain power. So some people think that Chanakya also talked about sustaining power. Yes, he did. But the objective of two philosophers were totally different. Whereas Machiavelli was more concerned about sustaining power, and he talked about power. Chanakya felt that this power, which has to be with the king, is for a different purpose. It is for the people. So that's the difference between what Machiavelli said in his seminal document called Prince. Chanakya had a different way of looking at it. Yes, he felt that the ultimate purpose of existence of any kingdom is the people of that kingdom. It is not the king himself. So king has to perpetuate himself. King has to survive in a difficult set of circumstances. He talks about how can a king survive, how can a king thrive, but the purpose was not the king. The purpose were the people. So in that sense, Chanakya was very different from Machiavelli, or for that matter, other philosophers. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, Chanakya is misunderstood to be known as a schemer. Yes, he talked about schemes, he talked about sustaining power, but the purpose was totally different. And here, Chanakya wanted every individual to be street smart, not a fool, yet not immoral. So as he said, he's often quoted that a straight tree is cut first. So you don't have to be straight like a tree, but you don't have to be cunning. You have to understand the set of circumstances and respond to the set of circumstances. So for Chanakya, there are no strict set of principles to be observed, no matter what the circumstances are. He was responding to the set of circumstances, and that is precisely what he was suggesting to others, that you must understand this set of circumstances before you respond to them. Your response can't be predetermined, as in case of Immanuel Kant. He said, that's your duty, you should do that irrespective of what the consequences are. No, Chanakya talks it totally differently. He says that you should be conscious about the consequences of what you're going to do, and your actions should be determined on the basis of what are the likely consequences thereof. So he was totally different to Kant in that sense. So what did Chanakya say and what did he do? As I said, he was espousing his philosophy in a particular context, and that context was, small princely states, small states which were fighting against each other. There was also that external invasion of Alexander that was taking place around that time. So he was concerned about external invaders, and he was also convinced that unless all these states in the country, the princely states in this country, came together, they will never be able to ward off the Greek threat. And that's why when the Magad Empire came into being, it was able to ward off the threat of the Greeks on the Western Front. So that was the objective of Chanakya. But as I mentioned earlier, the primary objective of Chanakya were people. Now, for people also, unlike the Greek philosophers which were talking of in the spiritual context, Chanakya was very clear in his mind. He said, it is the material well-being which is supreme. His entire philosophy, his entire ethics is based on this clear understanding that unless people are able to do well physically, they will not survive, leave alone thinking about spirituality or anything else. Everything has to be done to ensure material well-being of people of that particular country. Now, he said, yes, you have to think in terms of dharma, kam, moksha, but this all dependent on your material well-being. As I try to understand Chanakya, he said if you don't exist, your existence is determined by your material well-being. It may not be the ultimate spiritual goal, but if your existence itself is threatened, what sort of a dharma, kam, moksha that you're talking of if you don't have earth? So it's not, again, there may be a difference opinion here. Yes, he was focusing on the material, but the focus on material was because he thought that economic well-being is the foundation of everything else, whether it is dharma, whether it's moksha. He feels that you can't follow your dharma if you're not materially well off. If you don't exist materially, then what sort of a dharma that you're talking of? And hence for him, material well-being of individuals is extremely, extremely critical. From here, he comes on to the next level, that because it was an agrarian economy at that point in time, and material well-being was dependent on the land that you had. If you didn't have land, you won't be able to grow crops. If you're unable to grow crops, how will there be a material well-being? So the next step that he thought, after considering that material well-being is supreme for human being, he said that you must have land. Of course, individuals, very difficult for them to have land. He was talking in the larger context of his kingdom that he was serving. He felt that land has to be available in the kingdom. Obviously, it will then be given to people to cultivate that land, and their material well-being will improve. But obviously, the individuals themselves will not be able to acquire that land. That acquisition of land incremental acquisition of land will come through the state, the king. And hence he says, if the state doesn't grow, the state has to grow. It's like a human organ. If it's not growing, it will decay. There's nothing called static here. Everything has to grow or it will decay. And hence, he felt that if state doesn't grow, then it will die. And hence the state has to grow. He goes on to explain on how the state grows, but this fundamental aspect has to be understood very clearly, that the material well-being of individuals or of the organization or of the state is very, very important, is critical, is the essence. And that's why he wrote Arthashastra. And then for material well-being, the country or the state should have land. If it doesn't have land, material well-being will not. I mean, there weren't very many industries then. It was basically based on agriculture, and hence incrementally the country has to increase its land wealth, so to say. And if its state doesn't grow, it will perish. Now, the task of the king in any country was to ensure a secure material well-being of its people. Again, deriving from this, since material well-being is supreme, hence it is absolutely imperative that the king has to ensure that people are materially well off. But how do you get it? He talked about land is the source of all material. You have to acquire land. How do you acquire land? Through war. Again, it might appear a bit different now because today the context is very different. Today, your material well-being is not determined by the area that you acquire. So, for example, Japan has very small area, but it's economically very powerful. So, there are other ways in which you become economically powerful. But we are talking in terms of 350, 300 BC, when land was the key component in terms of economic well-being. And hence, acquisition of land became more and more important. Today, it's not so. Today, the largest country may not be the most prosperous country. The size of the country doesn't really determine the prosperity of that country. What is determined then? What was determined then was the more land you had, the more crops you could grow, and there would be a prosperous well-being. So how do you go about it? You have to have a war. I mean, Chanakya didn't say that you enter into war with everyone and anyone. No, he was very smart, and we'll talk about it. What is this? How do you go on to win such wars? What do you do with your enemies? That he talked subsequently, but fundamentally he said that without war, because no one is going to concede land to you on his own, you have to be powerful. If you are powerful, then either through war or through pressure, you will be able to acquire more land. But it's very important. He thought it was very important at that point in time that you have to be in a constant state of war with people around you so that you can acquire more and more land. And as a consequence of which, because in those days there were obviously no aeroplanes or no huge ships available to go to other countries and conquer them, you have to go through land. So the immediate acquisition of land would take place in the immediate vicinity, which is your neighbor. So that's why he said, your neighbor is a natural enemy. It's ironic that today in India we face a similar situation. We have neighbors like China and Pakistan who are now not so natural, but I would call them unnatural enemies, which indeed they are, because there is a conflict of interest here. Now, so if neighbor is a natural enemy, then Chanakya goes on to explain how do you handle that neighbor. So he talked about the Shadgun Niti, the Niti that he had, this six-fold strategy. The first was, if enemy is strong, go for Sandhi. Now here again, some ethical philosopher will say that you should have a particular policy irrespective of how your enemy is. Chanakya doesn't believe in that. Chanakya says you have to evaluate how the other person is and you have to formulate your strategy accordingly. So he was a strategist. He didn't have fundamental principle that, okay, this is my ideology and I'll follow that ideology irrespective of how my neighbor is. No. For Chanakya, the ideology was basically what would ultimately benefit the country. If a particular approach benefited the country, he would adopt it. He will not go in for any fundamental principles that you should do this, you should do that. In that sense, Chanakya very correctly felt that if an enemy is strong, what is the big deal in fighting with it? So, for example, we have China across the border, a very strong enemy. Now, it may not be easy to befriend it, but it would be foolish to go to war with a very strong country. You know what are the consequences. So, you have to find other ways to handle such a country, but not go into a war with that country. The idea here, what he says is, try and befriend that country. In the present day context, befriending could mean many things. In those days, it was only political in nature. Now, it could be economic befriending. You get into a bilateral arrangement on the economic front, meaning thereby you engage with that country, and hence going to war may be also harmful to them. Purely militarily, you may not be as strong, but if you engage with them, and that's the Sandhi part that Chanakya perhaps said, that enter into some sort of a friendship with someone who you perceive as to be powerful. It would be foolish to go to a war with that one. Then, this again is a part of a strategy. So, it is not, he is not being immoral, so to say, but what he's saying, he is being realistic. Chanakya was pure realist. He was not an idealist. He was realist. He was responding to the set of circumstances that he faced. So, once you become strong, then you can think in terms of breaking up with him. So, I don't know if any one of you has read this book by Akio Morita Made in Japan, and he brings about a similar concept. He says, when you want to establish your own brand, instead of going and fighting with an existing brand, you try and ride that brand somehow, cooperate with that brand, and learn from how they have created that brand. Create your own understanding, identity as a part of that brand, and once you become a reasonably good brand, you take off. Akio Morita is the founder of Sony, and he was very clear in his mind that instead of fighting it out with everyone, try and ride an existing brand. I think it comes from Chanakya Niti. That's where he says Vigra. Then station your forces near the territory. Again, this is in the physical sense, because at that point in time, you are only talking of neighbors, no? You're not fighting with a country far away. And in any case, you have got to far away, you go on land. You don't shoot missiles as we do today. So, station your forces. This is important. Number one, for quick deployment. In case there is a war, you could deploy it immediately. And secondly, to convey to your neighbor that you're strong. How do you do that? Even now, things happen. You have these Operation Brass Tacks, if you remember, was taken off in the deserts of Rajasthan to demonstrate to Pakistan how powerful we are. So, countries do that. You have these sea exercises. What are these? Basically demonstrating your power to your adversary, that if you dare, then we are prepared to take you on. So, this is what he said. Then exercise near enemy territory. So, not only stationing them there, you have those exercises. As I mentioned about the sea exercises, the land exercises. Many countries joined hands. India joined hands with the US forces, undertook those exercises. With other countries also, we've been doing that. So, you have to do this exercise. The objective of this exercise is very clear, just to demonstrate to your adversary that you are in a position to take you on if something untoward happens. Then join hands with the similar objectives. This is a strategy which is even applied now. Enemy's enemy is my friend. So, if you have somebody, so for example, China and America are not in good terms, you tie up with America to face China. So, if there are enemies or the enemies around, Chanakya was very right. It happens every day now. It happens in personal life. It happens in political warfare. It happens. You find an enemy of an enemy and join hands. You may not be very friendly with him, but for a purpose. I keep saying that. Chanakya, the objective was very clear. He had no, so to say, fundamental principles of right and wrong. He said, it depends on the set of circumstances and you have to respond accordingly. And this is also one such principle. Then, this again is very, very important. What he called the Dvayada Bhava. Why should you open two different fronts? And India faces that dilemma today, the Chinese front, the Pakistan front. And hence, it's important to balance the two, because if you have two fronts, there could be trouble for you. And that's what Chanakya says, never open two fronts. So, this is basically the niti that he had on how to grapple with the set of circumstances that you're faced with and prepare yourself for war, for expansion. And the fundamental objective is the one that I showed in the previous slide, that each country has to acquire more and more land. And this sort of a niti would help you do that. Then what is the approach to be adopted? And this is an often used word, Sam, Dam, Bhed, Dand. Usually, I remember when I was youngster, we used to say Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed. No, it is Sam, Dam, Bhed, Dand. Start with conciliation. Don't get into a war straight away. That's what he says. And absolutely, it's a very sensible thing to go about it. Don't jump into a war. First, the attempt should be conciliation. So, for example, if you have a stronger enemy and you know for sure that you're going to lose out, there's no harm in offering something to them. So there are no principles that I will not offer to A, B, C, D something because he's basically wrong. There are no principles here. I keep repeating this because usually we would believe that why should I engage with a person which I consider to be wrong? Chanakya said, no, it could be beneficial to you. If it is beneficial to you, engage with him. Some of us have these principles that I will not engage with anything who's fundamentally wrong. Chanakya says, no, if it is beneficial to you, engage with a person who you may consider to be wrong. So, or maybe strong. If he's stronger to you, it is better to enter into conciliation and maybe offer something. Because that probably will prevent a greater damage. You know, many countries allow other countries to have their forces stationed in their own country. Now, in principle, some people may disagree with it, that it impacts the sovereignty of the country where other forces are getting stationed. But some politicians may feel that by their positioning, though we may compromise a bit of sovereignty, it gives us a sense of security against a greater adversary. Now, I'm not passing a value judgment on this. This is actually being done. A lot of what Chanakya says or had said is actually being practiced not only in politics, but also amongst the businesses. So, what he said so many centuries ago is very relevant even today. So, conciliation is fun. Then, Dam, pay economic value. In case you feel that by paying that economic value, you can keep that adversary at bay, which impacts or which helps you in a longer run, then it is worthwhile doing that. You should not have such principles as to, I will not pay up. Again, I'm not trying to pass a value judgment here. Many people pay a sum to a particular overlord at some point in time, which is called the safety money that they give for their own security. So he said, pay it up because the otherwise cost would be much higher. Then bhed. Create differences within those countries, within the people there. So if it happens, all the espionage these days, which happened, there are many countries using their spies to go into other countries, even now, to create dissension within the society, within the polity, so as to make them weak. And that's what he says. Ultimately, all this doesn't work, then go to force. What has to be understood very clearly, this is the sequence in which this has to be used. It can't be, you can't start using force up front. Use of force is the final effort that you have to make. It's the last resort, not before that. Before that, try it for conciliation to begin with. Then, if conciliation doesn't happen, try and pay up some amount to buy peace, so to say, for a better time, and then simultaneously use trickery to make your adversary weak. If all this doesn't work, then if you are powerful enough, use force. It will be foolish to jump on to use force upfront. So Chanakya was talking at two levels. One is at the level of your adversaries outside the country, your enemies. How do you expand? The other is, for doing that, he felt that internally you should be strong. So, whereas on the one hand, Chanakya is talking about the art of war, how to conduct that war, what to do. The other is how to run your own administration, because he believed that unless you are internally powerful, until your administration is good for the people, until your administration is strong, you will never be able to expand. To him, expansion was the ultimate thing, acquiring more land. But that expansion can happen only if you are internally strong within the country. So that's extremely critical, that how do you make your administration strong? And this is what he says here. He says, king has to be strong. He pivots it. Now, in today's context, we may find it different because we live in a democracy. In his time, king played a very pivotal role. all the allegiance in a country, if you can call that one, was to the king, to the flag. So the king had to be very strong. If king weren't strong, then the kingdom will collapse one day or the other. If you look at history, that's what has happened. Strong kings have survived, weak kings have collapsed. And not only have they collapsed, their entire kingdom collapsed. In the future was written off. So king was very important. Then next to kings were the senior ministers. So for him, ministers had a very, very important role to play in running the administration. And again, this is true of any time. Minister had to be trustworthy. They could be trusted. So he was aware that king cannot carry out all the tasks. He had to delegate a lot of work to ministers. And hence, if the ministers were not trustworthy, then the mandate of the king or what he desired would not be carried out. And more than that, not only should they be trustworthy, they should not be selfish. This is very important. Because if the ministers are selfish, then the purpose of the kingdom, the purpose which the king has in mind will not be served, because then the ministers will be self-serving rather than serving the people. Again, Chanakya is very clear in his mind that whatever is happening in the kingdom is for the people, and people will not be served if ministers are selfish. So true even now, not only in India, elsewhere in the world. So Chanakya, whatever has said, has so much relevance in the present day context. Imagine he said it so many centuries ago, so much relevant even today. So the Amatyas, the ministers, have to be trustworthy, trust towards the king. So king can trust them. Once he trusts them, he'll be able to delegate. Once he delegates them, the ministers will be able to perform. So this was an important aspect of Chanakya's understanding of administration, and obviously they couldn't be selfish. Then the fort has to be strong. Fort is physical fort. What do you create? Because when there is enemy coming around you, if you have a strong fort around you, then the enemies cannot penetrate. So if the fort is strong, then you are able to run the administration inside well. Janpad, to me, this is the most important aspect of Chanakya. You know, if people are happy in a country, Chanakya felt, then the country will be strong. And people will be happy if they are a source of revenue. Meaning thereby, if the people are able to generate wealth, they will provide revenue. If the people are unhappy and they are not able to cultivate their land, they are not able to get money from their land, they will not be able to pay revenue to the state. Where does the revenue come from? Revenue comes from the people. And if people are unhappy, if they are unable to produce, they will not be able to give revenue to the country. So if a country has to be strong economically, then the people have to be strong economically. They will have to produce so much that they are able to part with some revenue which can be taken for functioning of the government. So people had a very important role to play in the entire administrative structure that he had. Then of course, this we've been talking about, if a country has to be strong, it has to have military strength. And this also comes from here. You can't have a strong military without sufficient revenue. Chanakya is very clear in his mind that if there is no revenue flow, you cannot maintain or sustain an army or a military here. It can only be done if revenue continues to flow there. But you have to have a strong army. If the army or the military is not strong, then the country will not survive. The Kosh, the treasury, this is linked from here. Where does the money flow into the treasury? It comes from people, the revenue. And without money, I have used this phrase in a different context. I have said that for any idea to fructify and sustain over a period of time, I say it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, emotionally relatable, and environmentally sustainable. Of these 8 pillars that I've talked about, financial sustainability is very, very important. And Chanakya was very clear in his mind that if there is no financial stability, if the treasury is not strong, no matter how good you are, the country will not survive. But these are all related concepts. You must understand, this is all related. Durg is important for protection. Janpad is important for flow of revenue. Military strength is again important for protection. Kosh, the economic well-being or the money in the treasury is important to run welfare scheme or to maintain this. And finally, he talks about allies, mitra. They are extremely critical. You have to have people around you who you can rely upon. And when say people, it's countries. Your neighbors could be your friend, you could be your enemy. You have to have friends who stand you in good stead. One other aspect which Chanakya was very concerned with was corruption. And his prescription for handling corruption is as valid today as it was then. He was clear in his mind that fish lives in water, then obviously it will drink a lot of water. Of course, scientifically fish don't drink water, but that's what Chanakya said. He said if you put a honey drop on the tongue, it's very likely that you're going to swallow it because you like it. So he felt that bureaucracy or civil service is naturally corrupt, but it is not good for administration. So whereas corruption is natural because of the nature of the bureaucracy of the people, that since they have so much wealth around them, the chances are that they're going to take that wealth. You have to have systems in place to ensure that they don't become corrupt. And he had a very good set of prescriptions for ensuring that the bureaucracy does not become corrupt, because there would be a tendency to become corrupt in the wake of the opportunities that are available to the bureaucracy, as could be true even today. There are so many opportunities to make money. What sort of a system should be put in place to ensure that the bureaucracy does not become corrupt? Because he felt that if bureaucracy becomes corrupt, then the whole administration will collapse. To him, it was extremely important to ensure that the bureaucracy was not corrupted, though the natural circumstances were such that there were chances of bureaucracy becoming corrupt. It was in this context he came up with this prescription of how do you tackle corruption. He said, honey in the tongue, it is not possible not to taste it. Now, how do you ensure that honey doesn't drop on the tongue? That's what he meant. And his prescription was as follows. Number one, right sizing the bureaucracy. Even today, the government mentions that more governance, less government. What does it mean? You have only appropriate number of people in bureaucracy. Large number of people in bureaucracy leads to corruption. That's what Chanakya said, and how true it is. Then transfer officers before they understand loopholes. I think the entire transfer policy of the government is based on this, that if you're there for more than 3 years, you understand how to make money. If you are transferred frequently, it will take you some time for you to understand how to make money in that organization, and hence Chanakya also felt that transfer is essential. If you keep an officer at a place for a longer time, the chances of his being corrupt are much more than shifting him out. That's what he said. Then give security and reward to whistleblowers. This again is something which is being talked about today, that there would be honest people around and they would be talking about corruption within the organization. Now, if they're not protected, no one is going to talk about it. So not only have to be protected, they have to be rewarded. If that happens, then anyone who's corrupt will always be apprehensive that his story may be told at the right or wrong places and he can get caught. Once he has that apprehension in mind, then obviously the chances of him becoming corrupt get reduced substantially, because he will not be, first of all, very brazen about what he is doing. He will at least try to hide something, and then he will always fear that some whistleblower can speak up someday and he might be in trouble. So whistleblowers, to Chanakya, had a very important role to play. This is also very important. He said that the entire chain, if you catch somebody corrupt, maybe that person may be caught being caught while taking money, but there should be people up and down who could also be beneficiaries in it. So if you don't take action against the entire chain, then the corruption will not be eliminated. That guy may be removed, the other chap will come and start doing the same thing. Because corruption, to Chanakya, was not a single step or a single moment. It was a chain of action, and unless you consider the entire chain of action, it would be difficult to eliminate corruption from the organization. Removing one individual caught being corrupt may not solve the problem, because others may take his place. So you have, when you catch somebody in a corrupt practice, find out the entire chain and remove the entire chain in order to eliminate corruption. To him, bribe giver is as wrong as the bribe taker. Now, this was something which was not realized earlier in the Indian context. Even now, very recently, the act was amended to also penalize the person who's giving money. So he said, if there are no bribe givers, how will there be bribe takers? So bribe giver to him is as much culpable as a bribe taker. So he has also to be punished. This is an important aspect of Chanakya way of handling corruption. He said that if a corrupt official or officials, they are humiliated in public, it will send a clear message to others not to indulge in similar. So to Chanakya, apart from the financial and the other, he may be put behind the bars, but if it is publicly shamed, then the others will think twice before indulging in similar practice. To him, public humiliation of corrupt officials was very, very important. Then, of course, whereas on the one hand, Chanakya talked about taking action against dishonest officers, he was of the view that honest officers should be rewarded, something which is happening now. Honest officers actually being rewarded. It is, to my mind, it's not merely the financial reward. What is equally important is the good name that gets associated with an honest officer. So if an officer is honest, then his reputation matters. It matters so much even now that good officers are good not merely because they are themselves honest. They develop a reputation for themselves that they are sought after. They are efficient, honest officers even today. And this can happen if we reward the officers financially and also otherwise by positioning such officers in such positions which may appear to be lucrative, but they are honest and they are able to deliver. And of course, compensate the person who has suffered as a consequence of corrupt practices. You know, there's so many people approaching the government for so much work. And if a particular person suffers on account of corrupt practices of a bureaucrat, then he should be compensated. Recently, there was a Supreme Court judgment in which the Supreme Court judge condemned the use of bulldozers without following the due process of law. I had read a question there that shouldn't the civil servant responsible for using those bulldozers should be held personally liable for doing something which is unconstitutional. If the Supreme Court feels embarrassed, feels bad about something that has happened, obviously it is not a legal way of going about it, but just comments perhaps will not matter. Action against those civil servants will matter. Perhaps if Chanakya had been around, he would have gone ahead and taken action against those civil servants as well. If corruption, and corruption is not merely financial, there could be other types of corruption. If that takes place, if demonstrated action is not taken against officials violating laws and constitution, it would be difficult to eliminate corruption. We do perhaps need Chanakya even today to carry out corruption, to eliminate corruption. So this is what I had to say about Chanakya. In the next session, we'll talk about Dr. Rajaram Mohan Rai. We'll come on to the modern Indian philosophers, but this is Chanakya way back in 4th century BC when Greek philosophers were talking about spirituality, they were talking about intellectualism. Chanakya talked about the realist, the problems that we face in the real world, which are as many problems today we face in the real world today, and Chanakya is as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Thank you very much.
StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।